What is up, creators? I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to try to replicate the style from Becki and Chris. So Becki and Chris was one of the first profiles that we checked out in the Analyze series, but a long time has elapsed since then. So today we're going to revisit it because their style has changed quite a bit, but also my approach to editing. Now, this style was a suggestion by Sebastian in the comment section on a previous video. So again, if you have any other videos that you want me to make, put it down in the comment section and I'll check it out. So you know how this works. First of all, we're going to check out some examples of their images and break down what they do in the color grading. And then we're going to apply that knowledge while editing a photo in Lightroom and creating a preset out of it. So let's get to it. So creators, here we have Becki and Chris's profile. Becki and Chris, just like that, if you want to go and follow them. And I highly recommend you guys do check out their YouTube channel. It's just incredible entertainment, whether it be photography videos, whether it be home renovation, or in particular their helicopter series. Those ones are high quality. I highly recommend you guys to check them out. Now, taking a broad look at their feed, we can see their style and how it compares to the style that we replicated a couple of years ago. While before we had a very moody, very dark and contrasty style, now we have the same desaturated style, but in this case, it's a lot warmer and a lot brighter. So let's start breaking the style down and starting out with the exposure and contrast, because right here we can see images that have a lot of information. They're not as moody, as dark as the previous style. Right now we have loads of information in the shadows. They're raising them up, and then they're decreasing the highlights, so we have a lot of detail in the sky as well. So it's a flatter looking style, an evenly lit style with a lot of detail. In comparison, the previous style was very contrasty and very dark. Now, there are some images where we see pure whites, like in this case in the sky, but in most of the cases they're going to bring down the highlights and the whites, so we have an even lit scenario. Now, in terms of the blacks, right here we can see how the blacks, well, they're not blacks, they're grayed out, they're faded out, and we can do this in the tone curve. Then talking about colors, we can see that their overall color palette is very flat, very desaturated. Blues in the skies are going to be greatly desaturated. There's only a bit of blue in the sky. Then the greens are also gone, magentas, purples, basically all of the colors with the exception of the yellows and the reds, the warm tones. So that's why we have a very desaturated and muted palette. All the images have this very desaturated look, with making emphasis only in the warm tones. Right here we can even see Chris's arm, which is being affected by the steep desaturation that they're adding in HSL. Now, most of the images of the older style had a very cool look to them. Now, in this case, we have a warmer look. So they're adding a bit of a warmth in color grading, and that's throughout the entirety of the image. That's why the new style is very vivid and very candid in comparison to the previous one. Now, there are some cases where we can see a little bit of variation. Like in this case, we can see how they add a bit of green or emerald color in the shadows. We can see the jacket, how they have this very green tint, and we can basically add them in color grading as a separate preset, just a little variant on their style. So that's the style that we want to replicate. Now let's jump into Lightroom and start color grading. But before that, as always, I'm going to remind you that these two presets that we're going to create today are included in the Analyze preset pack V3. Link up here to my shop in case you want to check it out. In the Analyze V3, you're going to find all the presets that we've created in the Analyze series throughout this season. So that's a great way to save a bit of time and skip my tutorials, but in the process, you can support me. Also, browse around my shop. Maybe you find my personal presets or my personal LUTs that I use every single day to edit in a faster manner helpful. And if you can support me in that manner, I'm very thankful. If not, don't worry guys, let's jump into Lightroom and start editing. So creators, here I am in Lightroom Classic, and don't worry if you're using another version of Lightroom, it's exactly the same process. So right here I have this selection of images. None of them are epic, shot in a helicopter, but they'll do the job in terms of colors. So I'm going to select this one, and with D on my keyboard, I'm going to move to the develop module. So starting out, we want to nail down the exposure and contrast. We want more information in the shadows, in the highlights, and fade out those blacks. So first of all, with the highlights, I'm just going to drag them down towards the negatives to achieve more detail in the skies in particular. We're going to see a lot more detail in the clouds start to appear by dragging it down. Now shadows, I don't want to go towards the negatives, otherwise we lose more detail or information in the shadows. We want to go towards the positives, so we have more information in these areas of the image, around the plus 70. Then whites and blacks control the extremes, while midtones are controlled by shadows and highlights. Then in the extremes we have the whites, brightest points in our image, and the blacks control the darkest points. So right here, the whites, I'm just going to leave them like that. But the blacks, I am just going to drag them down because we're losing a bit of intensity in our dark points on our image. Just going to drag it also slightly down around the minus 22. So as you can see, by raising the shadows, we have more detail in the midtones in the shadows, but the deepest points or the blackest points in our image are still retaining the strength. Next up, in the presence tab, we're not going to move anything. In the previous style, we did add a bit of clarity, or a bit too much clarity, but in this case, their style is a lot more natural. So I'm just going to leave it at 0, all these sliders. Then vibrance and saturation, these two, we're not going to move them. We are interested in making a desaturated style, but if we play around with these two sliders, we're just going to desaturate all the image. What we want to do is be a bit more selective, and for that, we're going to move down to the color mixer further along. But before that, the tone curve. So in the tone curve, we want to fade out those blacks. So right now we have pure blacks in our image. I'm just going to move this point at the left at the bottom. That will control the deepest points on our image. I'm not going to move it towards the right, otherwise we'll introduce more black. So I'm just going to drag it towards the positives, not too much, otherwise our image is completely flat, but ever so slightly just to fade out those blacks and make them a bit smoky. The output is going to be plus 15. Meanwhile, the input is going to be at 0 because we didn't move it in the x-axis. Now, the problem by fading out these blacks is that we're losing the contrast that we had, or we added over here in the basic corrections. So I'm just going to compensate that by adding a point in the region of the shadows, which should be, this is the midtones, the shadows should be around this area. So I'm just going to create a point over here, just drag it down to retain that contrast. So the input is going to be 35 and the output 41. And right now we're fading out those blacks. Notice how our blacks are a lot grayish compared to the original image, while returning the contrast and the amount of information that we added in the shadows in the basic corrections. So this is what the tone curve has done. This is before and after, just adding that grayish tint into the shadows. Okay, so that's it for the exposure and contrast. Now let's move down into the fun part, which is the color grading. Well, here we're going to use the color mixer, and in color mixer, we're going to go into mixer. And in this case, we're not going to use neither the tones, neither the luminance. We're just going to concentrate on the saturation sliders over here because, well, there's no point in changing the colors if we're going to desaturate them all. So starting out, the colors that we want to preserve first of all is the oranges and a bit of the reds. Why? Because as you can see, by moving the oranges, we're affecting my hand, therefore the skin tone. So I'm not interested in moving the skin tones. Let's start off with the blues. The blues were very desaturated, so I'm just going to drag them down. Maybe you can notice in my trousers, but we're going to see this change mostly in the skies. So I'm going to go with around a -60. You guys can push it further along to a -80 if you want. Going to do the same with the aquas, -60 over here. Magentas and purples were basically non-existent, so again to the -60s. And then I'm going to change the deeper greens with the green slider towards the negatives as well. In this case, I'm going to go a bit steep, maybe around the -80. And then the yellows will control the lighter greens, so again to the -80 as well. Maybe this is a bit too extreme. Further along, we're going to check it, and maybe we're going to revisit these two sliders. Oranges in this case, going to leave them like that. And then the reds, ever so slightly, we only have a bit of red over here in the compass, and in the cut that I have in my hand over here, I'm just going to drag it ever so slightly down towards the negatives. Around the -20s is going to be enough, just to decrease a bit of the saturation. By comparison with the original image, the change is very small. So here we can see the before and after. Our image is looking very flat, very desaturated, very similar to Becki and Chris's style. Now, one thing that remains is in color grading. We're going to go into the global color wheel and add that warm cast that we saw throughout the new style on his feed, on their feed. So I'm just going to add a bit of saturation over here. I'm going to add maybe more towards the oranges or towards the reddish tones. Maybe this value is going to be the hue of 33, and saturation obviously is way too much. I'm going to go ever so slightly, maybe around the 7 to 8%, not going to be too much, but just adding a bit of warmth into the image without being too sepia. So I'm going to deactivate the color grading. So this is before and after, just adding a slight warmish cast into our image. Okay, so our preset is basically complete, with the exception that we don't know if this -80 and the greens and the yellows is way too much. So before we save the preset, let's select, right click, settings, copy settings, and then I'm just going to copy all the ones that we used and just test these settings that we created in another image. So I'm just going to go maybe to this one over here. And here we have a great variety of greens. We have some lighter greens, some more vivid, some darker ones. So right click, settings, and we're going to paste the settings. So it's looking quite nice. The problem right here is that it is a bit too extreme. There's -80 in the yellows and the greens, which honestly, it looks quite similar to some of the images that we saw coming out from their feed. But just for purposes of not making this preset too radical, I'm just going to change this, and I'm just going to change it ever so slightly. I'm just going to click on the yellow, and then we have our plus and negative keys just to alter a bit of the saturation by 0.5%. So I'm just going to go maybe around to the 70s ever so slightly, then with the greens as well, plus to the 70s, just retaining a bit more saturation than we initially had. So I think right here, our preset is quite nice. We have that desaturation, we have loads more information in the shadows as we can see. Those blues are basically gone, but that was exactly what we were going for. And we only have the warm tones, which are preserved. We have a flatter looking exposure with that desaturated tones that we saw. So let's save the preset and see how it performs in other images before we create the variant. So just gonna go into presets over here, hit the plus sign and create preset. Remember right here, we want to name it and we don't want to mark anything that we didn't use. So for example, we didn't use any effects, post-crop vignetting, nor grain. We didn't use camera calibration. So let's apply Becki and Chris over here. And there we have our immediate results. It looks fantastic. Immediately you can see I have loads more information in the shadows compared to the original image. The highlights are a bit well preserved, better preserved. And then we have that desaturation in the sky. The two colors that really stand out are obviously the oranges over here and a bit of the yellow cast of the sun, which is exactly what we were going for. But it's looking very nice over here. How about this image of my friend Kevin in the mountains here? We have a lot of the green, so let's apply Becki and Chris 2024. And it looks fantastic. Here we can see the changes that we did into the greens. Very nice. Blues a bit desaturated. And right here we have a bit of oversaturation in the skin tones, but I attribute this more towards the camera because this was shot with the A6500 that had really accentuated greens and in particular yellows in the skins. But in this case, in the other senses, it looks quite nice. You can see how we have a bit more detail in the bright points on our image compared to the original because we lowered a bit of the highlights and the shadows have a lot more detail. Okay, jumping into this image, let's create the variant, which is very simple. Just gonna apply first of all the preset that we already created. It looks fantastic. You can see the amount of information in the shadows, that desaturation and that warm cast throughout the entirety of the image. But now let's go down into color grading and we're gonna go into the shadow wheel over here. Just add that green tint that we saw in some specific images. So I'm just gonna add a bit of saturation. You guys can maybe go around with more of an emerald or mint-like color. I'm gonna go more towards the traditional greens. The hue is going to be 125 and the saturation is going to be very minimal, maybe around 5%. And as you can see over here in the shadows, we're just adding a bit of green. You can deactivate what the shadows have done. This is before and after, and it's very slight, but just adding this green cast into the shadows and it's just looking quite nice. So let's save this as another variant. Okay, so let's see how the two presets perform. This is an image in Seville, in the setas of Seville. So let's apply Becki and Chris. The first one, and it looks fantastic. The sky is a bit desaturated, exactly what we're going for. Loads more information in the shadows and a bit more in the highlights and that overall warm cast. Now, if we add Becki and Chris green, the only change is that we have a very nice green cast in the shadows and it works quite nice with urban photography and the green tones in the shadows as well. Back to our original image. Now let's see the variant with some green tones, green over here, just adding a slight green into the shadows. So there you have my interpretation on Becki and Chris's latest style. And remember that these two presets are in the Analyze Preset Pack V3 and the Analyze LUT Pack V3. So I've reconverted these Lightroom presets into filters so you can apply them into your video work as well. So I'll link up here to my shop. If you can purchase anything over there, I'll be very thankful because we all know that YouTube AdSense pays next to nothing. And if not, if you can't, don't worry guys, just like the video, share it maybe on social media, in your Instagram stories or on Facebook groups. That actually helps me out quite a bit, just making the community grow. And that's it for today guys. Have a nice day, have a nice night wherever you are. I'm Tony Fuentes, cheers to all of you and I'll see you in the next one.